And so the subject tonight then is man in relation to prana and antimatter. There's hope that we can deal certainly with man and prana tonight, and if possible go on to the subject of antimatter this evening or in a later talk. We are constantly hearing, of course, about the great discoveries of science, and they are many. Our way of life is what it is because of science. These discoveries are meritable, and no one wishes to detract from them. But at these festivals, it has always been my endeavor to try and bring to the attention of the world, because at festivals world attention is directed, to bring attention to some of the discoveries that science has overlooked. You know, I grew up in the 1930s. I had a damn good education. It cost a lot of money. But I grew up believing, having been taught by science, that the moon came out of the Pacific, that the Earth, planet, bulged in the region of the Pacific, and a huge chunk of material was drawn out, and out of this was wrought the moon. It was nonsense, complete and utter nonsense. And we have to remember that about 80 years previous to our time today, Madame Blavatsky said that the moon was much older than the Earth. She estimated that it was about 500 million years older than the Earth. It was a preposterous proposition of hers. Science would have nothing of it. And it was our astronauts who brought back material from the moon who proved Madame Blavatsky right, that the moon's material was older than the Earth, that the moon had settled down, had existed as a planet long before the Earth. And so we are tonight to give heed to some of the great teachings of ancient wisdom that have later been proved correct, including those of Madame Blavatsky, but tonight in particular those of two very fine theosophists who were Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater. And then, of course, it was Madame Blavatsky who also said, 85 years ago, that man would begin to hear some of the stars long before he could see them, would begin to hear them before he could see them. And when our radio telescopes were set up in the 1940s, this event actually came true. The radio signals coming from outer space came, in many instances, from regions of the heavens where there was no visible light, no signs of stars, no signs of heavenly bodies at all. We know that there is something there, and radio waves are bringing that information in, but we cannot see anything there. And of course, Madame Blavatsky gave this proposition out. She died in the early 1890s, 1891, and about 5 years after her death, two young disciples of hers, Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater, began to look into the structure of matter. Annie Besant had been a politician. She was the doyenne of political society at that time. She was of high integrity, and this is important to remember, a magnificent orator, often spoke in the Albert Hall. She was a journalist, and she was a feminist. She had an impeccable background. She was given Madame Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine, by her newspaper to review, more in derision than anything else. And she read it, and she was fascinated by it. And she decided she would give her life to this old lady who was obviously dying and had written this secret doctrine. She said her master was the Master Moya, the Master M, on the first ray of will and power. And she combined with a priest in the Church of England, Reverend Leadbeater, and together they formed a team who used clairvoyance to look into the structure of matter during the late 1890s. And so, together, they began to explore the elements. What were they made of? Science at that time was still saying that the elements, gold, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sodium, potassium, the many elements, were made up of round balls of matter, that they were indivisible, and the structure was more or less as it was seen outwardly. Gold was tiny little particles of gold, and so on. And so they began to use their perceptive faculties to explore these elements with clairvoyance. Science was beginning at that stage to get beyond the idea that these elements were merely solid balls of the material that could be seen. Even at that stage it was mooted that perhaps these balls of material, these atoms, might have a nucleus and an outer unstable material. Now, you and I grew up with a very established scientific concept of what matter is. You and I grew up with the belief, we accepted it for a long, long time, that matter was made up of a nucleus and that electrons rotated around the nucleus like planets around the sun. And this was a lovely concept. We all loved it very much, but it got a little boring after a while. All we could say was that the nucleus of gold was larger than the nucleus of hydrogen and that it had more planets. And the nucleus was pretty solid. And then later on, we came to a concept that the nucleus was made up of particles called protons. And we'll see one of them in a moment, a bunch of these particles together made up the nucleus. But that was well into the century. We're going back to the 1890s. These two very gentle people began to look clairvoyantly into all these elements. Leadbeater said that he was able to extrude from the sacred square inch between his eyebrows an etheric object like a tunnel, like a pipe. And when he extruded this in etheric substance, he was able to gaze through it by means of his aroused Ajna chakra into the structure of the tiniest atom. Annie Besant acted as somebody who confirmed what was being observed, and together they formed a wonderful team. Now, what was it that they saw, using these extraordinary occult powers to magnify an invisible atom? Merely by holding a piece of gold in their hands, they could magnify a gold atom in front of their clairvoyant view. What was it that they began to see? They took fragments of each of the elements and went into them very carefully. They were staggered by what they saw. The symmetry of the many particles in each of these elements, the glorious symmetry of these particles, the order of them, the patterns that they formed, their infinite variety. Each element was completely different from the rest, and yet there seemed to be similarities in the various classifications of chemistry. Let us take, for instance, the example of hydrogen. Looking into the hydrogen atom, they counted 18 particles, as we see in our diagram here. And the 18 particles were arranged in two triangles containing 3 groupings, making 9 particles in the one triangle, which seemed to be somewhat related or interlaced with a second triangle, which C.W. Leadbeater said was a mirror image of the other one. This is what they were seeing in hydrogen when science was merely reporting at that stage in the 1890s that matter was solid material. Some were even mooting that there were particles rotating around the atom. But this is what the clairvoyants saw. When we came to oxygen, when they came to oxygen, they saw oxygen as a spiral, a twin helix. Nitrogen was an extraordinary shape, looking something like a number 5 domino. It had 5 major groupings of particles, and one of them had a sort of a lip, and that was nitrogen. And so they went very carefully through all the known elements and counted the particles, drew their arrangements, observed their symmetry again and again. And then they went back further, beyond the atom, and they began to examine these particles which made the atom up, which are shown as tiny little hearts. Now, in truth, the credit for the structure of the ultimate atom lay with an American. And the American's name was a Dr. Babbitt. And in the 1860s, from nowhere, he had drawn what he said was the ultimate particle of matter. The particle that I'm showing you here, which has been blown up to a visible size. His assertion was that this particle was no particle at all, this ultimate particle of matter. In fact, it was merely a vortex of energy. A vortex of energy. And the energy flowed in at a negative end, which we call the vortex, and poured out from this extraordinary object at its positive end in what he called a torrent. There was no material in it at all. It was just a circulation of high-powered energy. It's not easy to grasp the full manifestations of this extraordinary object. And what I'm going to demonstrate now is merely an attempt to show you what they saw, and which Leadbeater later confirmed to be the structure of the ultimate particle of physical matter. According to all the clairvoyants, the ultimate particle of matter was a hoop of energy. A hoop of energy. And as you look at this spiraled rope here, you can see coils of this supposed energy. And this energy formed, as it were, a complete circle. This was true to the occult teachings of Hinduism and of all the ancient cultures, even those of South American Indians. The snake biting its tail was the symbol of infinity, but it was also the symbol of matter. The swastika, 70 years before Hitler, or shall I say many, many thousands of years before Hitler, was an endeavor to symbolize in a circle the rotation of energy, the whirling of the energy in the crooked cross. Now, the way in which the particle is formed out of these hoops, and all matter is derived from it, is as follows. The hoop has got, as it were, a central core which is wound around in this fashion, running up the center of the atom. If you look at my arm, you can regard my arm as Fohat, a force pouring into the atom constantly and flowing its energies through this coil of material. And so there was an inner core, a spiraling core, and the rest of the loop was wrapped around, this central core, and the end joined up with the beginning in the center. And so what we're looking at, excluding my arm, which is merely the forehead energy pouring in at the vortex of the atom and coming out at the torrent, what is left apart from my arm is this torrent, this extraordinary circle, this loop of rotating energy. And so now, looking back to the drawing which I showed you earlier, we have got, as it were, merely a more accurate and detailed observation of what the anu, the ultimate physical particle, was composed of. But the matter was not as simple as that. According to ancient wisdom, there must be represented in all matter, no matter how gross, the element of emotion, the element of mind or mentality, and even the elements of spirit. All things must contain this. And indeed, the atom of Babbitt, the real atom of Babbitt, the ultimate atom of Babbitt and Leadbeater, is not quite as simple as you see it there. In fact, we have this proposition, that whilst the coil that I have just drawn together represents energy flowing in a vortex to make physical matter, wrapped around the physical part of the atom is a flow of emotional energy, which is depicted here in a lighter colored and smaller coiled cord. So here we have then physical energy, measurable, testable by science, and emotional energy wrapped around it, right the way through the atom. More than that, the emotional energy stream itself has wrapped around it another cotton, which is mental substance. Mental energy flowing in each atom. I don't want to take it much further, but around the mental energy there are flowing in cotton of a very fine quality spiritual energies. And so the pictures that we have looked at here of the anu depict what I have described. The large main coils in physical energies measurable by science, and spiraling around them astral energies, spiraling around the astral mental energies, and so on. Now, when Leadbeater observed this, he described the activity of this ultimate particle. He described it as being an activity in which this tiny little heart-shaped entity pulsated, moved, spiraled, gyrated, danced around continuously. All the time it was being maintained in its integrity by an inflow of energy in its north pole and an output of energy from its south pole. The ultimate atom, the anu, appeared from the astral plane. Coming out of the astral plane, an anu would emerge. And there were two kinds of anu. There was a male anu and there was a female anu. The difference between the male and the female were that the energies flowed in opposite directions. Otherwise, they had the same shape. And so he, with Annie Besant, observed that every now and again an anu popped into the physical plane. Before that, it was made up not of the thick rope, but of the thin rope that I showed you. And only when 49 of these astral atoms on the astral plane came together and formed a sort of nucleus, did one of them take energy from the rest and create itself in physical matter, in physical energy. And then it would appear on the physical plane. And for each one, he said, that appeared, one went back. One became depleted of energy and lost its physical spirals or coils and returned into the astral plane and energized 49 atoms there. Remember, this was in the 1890s. Now, he observed, of course, that there were many combinations of these particles. They would form groups of two. Later, very much later, we can think of these in terms of neutrinos. So now I've got to relate the Anu to science. It was Geoffrey Hodgson, after Leadbeater and Annie Besant were dead, who identified the Anu as being the electron, the negative electron, the negatively charged electron. The positive Anu was the negatively charged electron of science. These two brilliant clairvoyants consulted Sir William Crookes. Now, William Crookes was a famous chemist. He had been conducting the Katie King experiments. Katie King was a materializing medium. She was producing ectoplasm, and Sir William Crookes did an investigation again and again and published his results. And even though he was sympathetic to Besant and Leadbeater, he could not agree. He could see no possible recognition of their work. Later, Sir Oliver Lodge, another very important chemist, physicist of this century, became interested in the occult. His son had been killed in the First World War. He attended seances, eventually materialization seances. He was given material proof that his son had survived the grave. He was sympathetic towards the occult, but he could make no head nor tail of Leadbeater and Besant's work. It just didn't figure. Even today, the main scientific group of theosophists still do not regard Leadbeater's work as serious. Now let's begin to look into the field of science and see what has developed there in the meantime. What we need to do is to see, first of all, before we look at science, where man figures in all this. Where do you and I figure in it all? We know a lot about the physical body. We know that it's made of gas, liquid, and solid. The fifth state of matter, the sixth and the seventh. Gas, liquid, solid. That we can understand. But what they were talking about was the other part of man's physical body, the etheric body. The etheric body, which is that which interpenetrates the physical, that which the yogis describe as the vital body of man. And according to the theosophists, it is made up of 4 kinds of etheric matter. There they are. The first, the second, the third, and the fourth. The first etheric is made up of Anu. We've just been talking about them. Anu, of occult chemistry, the electron of science. The second etheric is made up of combinations of Anu. There they are. 2 Anu brought together in different combinations. So now we understand something of the second etheric. Particles derived from the Anu. Then the third etheric. And so we can see that the particles are brought together in different combinations to form the various etheric substances of the etheric body. All this, of course, is simple and plain, mundane interest to the esoteric student. So now we have to look at what science has observed. This is what Leadbeater proposed, This is what science proposed. I'm going to ask to move this board over now, please. Science was proposing that matter was nothing like this at all, that there were not discrete little particles forming subatomic particles in an atom. Thank you. Here we have nitrogen. Here we have nitrogen as depicted in the books that your children studied and even I studied. Nitrogen. The nucleus of the hydrogen atom. The nitrogen atom. 7 protons and 7 neutrons forming a tightly packed cluster. And around them 14 electrons, not any longer, according to science, forming an orbit like planets around the sun, but 14 electrons forming now, and very recently, since the 1940s, a cloud of electrons around this nucleus. Still nothing like what Leadbeater and Besant had seen. And this has held for a long, long time. I grew up with it, most of you have. We began to probe scientifically the core of this nucleus of the various elements. We would take high-energy protons. In other words, we would take a hydrogen atom without its electron, and we would bombard the nuclei of the atoms and scatter particles out of them. Out of nitrogen, we could bombard a proton into it and get helium, a proton, a neutron, beryllium, tritium, and so on. But all the time, science came back to this concept that nitrogen had 14 major particles in its core. Gold, I don't know what the number is, had 130. Carbon had 16. Oxygen, and so on. Back we came again and again to this dry old proposition that the nuclei of atoms were all the same, whereas Leadbeater was seeing it differently. He saw gold like this. This was the gold atom, a huge display of radiating, vibrating particles in gorgeous symmetry. The clairvoyant group stressed again and again the symmetry of matter, the symmetry of nature. Here is the symbol of hydrogen. The 2 triangles indicating the one which was masculine or positive on the outside and the negative one inside, according to Leadbeater. Now we must switch to science. Since the war, immense sums of money have been spent by science on building accelerators to make these particles go much faster that they're going to bombard nuclei with. Huge buildings were created like the Fermilab accelerator at Illinois, stretching 4 miles to rush these protons down these corridors, edging them on with radio energy until they reached incredible speeds. What was science trying to do? She was trying to feel out, to probe out the nucleus in order to test whether there were any other forces inside the atom that it knew nothing about. They found things like gravity, of course, magnetism, electromagnetism, certainly. They also found a strong force that held these particles together. They found a weak force, which is the basis of alchemy, and many others. These accelerators cost billions and billions. They would spiral down. The particles would be channeled down immensely long tunnels, and at the end of the tunnel they would be circulated around like this and brought into contact with others that were just arriving at tremendous speed so they would hit each other. And all the time the scientists, by various devices, were trying to assess what lay inside the atoms. But this was since the war. Before that, as you well know, some Italian physicists and Germans and others had come together and had found a way of splitting the atom. But that did not reveal much information about the nucleus of the atom. When they took uranium and bombarded it and produced nuclear fission, the breaking of the uranium nucleus, they got a release of light and heat and power which blew Hiroshima to nothing. And they found that two new elements were produced, strontium and something else. Alchemy was being performed by science. The teachings of the centuries that man could change one element to another were now being corroborated by science. Rutherford had begun to show that it was possible to produce a change of one element into another, which was all the occult teachings had been saying. What is the position today with science? Science has begun to find that in studying the proton, which is nearly what we've been talking about here, hydrogen, is beginning to find new particles. By accelerating these bombarding particles to tremendous speeds, so that they gathered energy carrying something like 400 million volts of energy in them, they were able to smash up some of the protons of hydrogen, and they found that there were particles there. When they examined them, the man who located them for the first time called these particles quarks, Q-U-A-R-K-S, quarks. He prefers to call them quarks because it sounds like quartz, and quartz was what he said the originator of the word was actually intending. Many people call them quarks. And so we find that when the proton is shattered, three particles emerge, which are called quarks. Now we must go back to the Anu. And remember that this Anu was identified by Hodgson as being an electron. What does the quark turn out to be? A particle that has different types of energy bound to it. And there are three energies bound to these quarks which science can recognize today. Current scientists call them commonness, and so quarks may have a dose of commonness about them. Notice the change in science today. The young scientists are even going metaphysical. They're entranced by what they're finding inside the atom. They found that the quarks had three kinds of energy. Commonness was one, strangeness was another, and extra strangeness was a third. They found, in fact, that, may I use this drawing in the absence of my blackboard, which has emigrated to the end of the platform. I would like it back again, please. Could I have it back a little bit? They found that the proton, which is the main body of the hydrogen, had three quarks. Two of the quarks were embodied with the energy of commonness. Look at them. Similar. And the third quark had the element of strangeness. What about these belonging to the other triangle? A group of scientists going into the quarks are now convinced that quarks are made up of electrons. And electrons are anu. And so what Leadbeater and Besant said is absolutely right. That the hydrogen atom is made up of combinations of anu. And even we're able to see something of these combinations. What science is to discover is that for this positive aspect of the hydrogen atom, these three quarks, there are three antiquarks. Three antiquarks. And Leadbeater's work and Besant's work will be vindicated certainly in my lifetime, in terms of the hydrogen atom at least. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I have been talking to you about here tonight is quiet confirmation. Very, very, very quiet. You can be absolutely sure that those two very brave occultists, let's be honest, esotericists, clairvoyants, that their work will be ignored by science. But do remember that their work cost nothing, except in terms of human endeavor and sacrifice. Long, long hours locked up in a house deep in a forest, studying again and again, counting ad nauseum the particles, drawing them again and again, observing the symmetry of the nuclei. That was the cost. But in terms of pounds, shillings and pence, or dollars and cents, nothing. What if science had given $1 million to clairvoyant research? What could not have emerged from those discoveries of 85 years ago? 2 world wars and $500 billion has brought us to a position wherein they very nearly have come to the level reached by 2 clairvoyants who knew nothing about science. And so, this is the situation today, except for this, that something far more exciting has been discovered. And this is the discovery of an energy which science is calling charm. You're all looking at me as if I'm making this up. But if you talk to your nuclear physicist friends or your youngsters at university, you will find that what I'm saying is correct. They have discovered a new energy called charm, which they call charm. And this energy arises through the interaction of certain particles which have just recently been manageable from their accelerators. We all know that as a planet passes the sun or passes another planet, that gravity is exerted between the 2 planets. We know that gravitons pass between the bodies of these planets. We also know that another energy is involved in light. If on the surface of the sun an electron is vibrated and emits a photon, the photon can excite an electron in our eyes, the electron emits lights, and we register it. But they have discovered last year that neutral particles called neutrinos, and there they are, neutral particles called neutrinos pull out a force from atoms that has never been discovered before. So powerful is this force that they call it a star-breaking force. And so when you take neutral particles like neutrinos, which has got a male and female anu, or male or positive electron and negative electron, positron and electron together, when this force passes near matter, it evokes an energy called charm. And this charm is being registered by the accelerators for the first time. And everyone is excited about it in the scientific world. What is this charm? They say that it is the energy of life. The energy of life. We say it is prana. We say it is prana. We say that this energy of life, now being measured for the first time, exists in various particles. The reason why the etheric body has not been photographed before, measured before, is because the mass of the etheric body that we've been talking about is made of neutral particles, neutrinos, particles of that order that I have shown on the wall there. Now, these neutrinos are not stopped by anything. They pass through walls, they pass through lead, they pass through absolutely anything. Because they are neutral in charge. You can't distract them with an opposite charge. And our etheric bodies are made of neutrinos and combinations of neutrinos, which are neutral. This is why we haven't been able to register them. But for the first time, science is beginning to register the effects of neutral particles. And so it's an exciting discovery, because it means that very shortly they're going to be able to sense that man has, interpenetrating his physical body, a physiological unit called the etheric body. I would draw your attention to a diagram that I have placed over here. According to these clairvoyant observers, they would say that an anu emerges from the astral plane loaded with energy, which it radiates, and indeed we have seen this in electrons, that clouds of photons like particles are emitted constantly from electrons. And they would say that these anu leave their energy in the physical world and then flow back to the astral plane. And so we have the path of a male anu leaving its energy behind and going back into the astral world. The spontaneous generation of matter. Have you not heard it before? Similarly, female anu, polarized in the opposite direction, emerge from the astral plane, leave their energies either free in the atmosphere or contained in the particles that I described earlier. And so particles draw, when they come together, draw this energy and combine it. And this is exactly what has happened to some of the heavy particles being measured in the accelerators by science today. These combinations of two electrons hold enormous amounts of energy together. And for the first time, we're beginning to measure them. The occultists have said all the time that there is a variety of these life-containing energy units, etheric units. And the most prominent of all is called the vitality globule. The vitality globule. The vitality globule is the basis of life for man. It contains 7 anu. And these anu are bound together with an energy which the yogis have called prana, and which science is discovering as charm. More than this, as Brenda Selby Johnson would confirm, there is evidence in England at university level that particles of this order trapped inside vacuum chambers are being photographed. And so we say that the vitality globule, which any of you can see if you wish, is now under observation. Firstly by science, as it begins to examine the energy of charm, and secondly by ourselves. The next time you ride in your plane above the clouds, put your eyes slightly out of focus, and you will see glistening white dots in the atmosphere that manifest for a short period of time and then disappear. They explode, in fact. They explode and release their charm into the atmosphere. Their prana, we call it. We're saying here that these vitality globules, which are the source of all our yoga endeavors, are now being probed. It is an exciting 50 years that lies ahead of us. And it has been forecast certainly by the masters that scientific evidence of an irrefutable nature, we all thought it was going to be Curlian photography, scientific evidence of an irrefutable nature is now being assembled, which will show that man has a body of vitalization. Scientists are thrilled by what they're seeing of the symmetry of matter, thrilled by charm, even suggesting that there are other energies. We may call them astral or mental. They are calling these new energies possibly things like truth and beauty. You're looking at me as if I'm mad, but I'm telling you the present scientific position, which it is my duty as a scientifically oriented investigator to understand. The young scientists are so thrilled with the symmetry of the universe, not only in outer space, but inside the atoms, that they are going all mystical and calling things, energies like charm and truth and beauty. And to that Plato would have said goodness as well. Truth, beauty, and goodness. And so what I have given you here tonight, and I shan't give any more, but I will answer questions. What I have given you tonight is, I hope, a painless excursion into occult chemistry. A chemistry which was formulated 85 years ago, and which science is going to corroborate very, very quickly. Perhaps the scientific group in London who has frowned, cold-shouldered the work of Leadbeater will now hasten to line up with him. I hope they do, and I shall forgive them. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer questions. A few minutes. Yes, Brad. I must say that I never heard that Leadbeater photographed chocolates. He saw them clairvoyantly. The chocolates were perceived clairvoyantly. But I'm not going to give you the material for my next lecture. And that is how the chakras are energized, how emotional energy is converted to physical or etheric energy, and how man is driven. By that I mean from an etheric astral level.